We're back with another deep dive into training with Dr Iñigo San Millán, the head of performance at UAE Emirates, the coach of Tadej Pogačar, and a leading light into the field of metabolomics research. Now, this time we are discussing a topic that affects far more of us than we would ever imagine. As before, we're going to leave the interview long, because frankly, everything he says, in my opinion, is gold. So enjoy and get involved in the comment section down below if you'd like to see more of this type of content. Iñigo, hello, welcome back to GCN again. This video, we're going to be talking about something that you wanted to focus on, right? Which is overtraining. Why is it something that you would like to talk to the GCN viewers about?
Well, thank you for the invitation again, Simon. My pleasure. The whole overtraining thing it's something that I've been dealing with athletes forever. I used to deal that when I was an athlete myself, and now it's something that I see all the time. And it is not just at the professional level. I'm seeing this at the amateur level, at the typical weekend warrior or the fat ass like me who only has maybe 10 hours a week to train, right? So, and what I see is that overall, there's a lack of understanding, lack of monitoring by many athletes about overtraining and getting fatigued.
Now, it's interesting you say that it happens across the spectrum of athletes, from professionals to, to the everyday person. So I guess probably a good way to start out is to explain the signs of overtraining, because it doesn't always feel like you're tired, does it? There are other signs.
When we get overtrained, and we all have gone through this period, everybody at some point in our lives, right? Me too. So, at some point you just get used to it many times, right? And you say like, yeah, I'm a cyclist, or I'm a triathlete, or I'm supposed to be tired, right? No, you're not supposed to be tired. What do you mean? Like, elite athletes are tired all the time because they train super hard, and I'm supposed to be athlete tired. No, they are not, So that's something that, when you have that feeling that, oh, I'm tired all the time, I'm tired, but yeah, I'm supposed to be tired. That's no good, right? That means that there's something wrong for sure. You're not supposed to be tired. You're supposed to be obviously tired during the training, depends on the training you do, but maybe afterwards. And maybe obviously towards the end of the day, maybe have a little bit of, okay, I'm tired, I'm going to go to bed early or so, but not feeling tired all the time, and think that it's normal. So that's the first sign to look into that. Then there are multiple signs out there. One other sign that I see is the heart rate, right? So I always ask people, listen to your heart, right, when they train. And this is why heart rate is very important, not just power output. We talked about in the other episode about the decoupling, right, and looking at the heart rate and power output. So a typical thing that everybody who has used heart rate for training has noticed is that at some point when they do high exercise intensities, right, the heart rate doesn't get up. Right? How many times we hear about, oh man, my heart rate didn't get up today. It's just go hard. And I know myself that at this power output and this intensity, my heart rate is 185 beats per minute, for example, right? 180. And now I'm like, 165, 168, and I'm struggling, right? That's another sign of fatigue right there. Okay. So, and that can come from lack of carbohydrates and glycogen, or just overall fatigue. But mainly is that, so one of the things that happens is that why heart rate is so important. Now the whole heart rate variability concept it's a big deal, but heart rate alone, it's a true physiological parameter, and it's telling you a lot of things. So when and this is very common now because we see this all the time, the heart rate doesn't get up, and you look at training peaks, in athletes, in races, and especially also stage races, and you see that the first stage, the heart rate gets up to maximum 190, and the maximum heart rate towards the end of the stage race, the fifth or sixth or seventh or so, is 168, right? So it's a sign of lack of nutrition and glycogen and fatigue. So the muscles store glycogen, and the glycogen has to be broken down into glucose for energy purposes, right? So what does allow that breakdown of glycogen into glucose It's an enzyme, but it's mediated by what we'd call the catecholamines, right? Which are epinephrine and norepinephrine, right? So the brain is the boss, right? And the brain mainly can only use glucose, right? So when the brain senses that there's not much glycogen in your body overall, it starts like mobilizing things. And the first thing it tells your legs, hey, legs, I don't care about your performance. I don't care about you have glycogen or not. If I need glucose. So if I don't have the glucose, you're not going to be able to do anything because I'm not going to function. So I don't want you to shut down all the glycogen breakdown into glucose, but don't use as much because I need it. Because the glycogen from any organ in the body can go to the bloodstream and end up in the brain, right? So what the body does, senses that, and it's going to reduce the glycogen breakdown, which is called glycogenolysis, a breakdown of glycogen into glucose. So by doing that, it decreases the catecholamine secretion, right? So there's not much breakdown. Now, what's the collateral effect of that? Heart rate is contracted by the catecholamines, and epinephrine or norepinephrine, which also is called adrenaline. Epinephrine and adrenaline is the same thing. We know about the adrenaline, that's what makes the heart goes higher, So that's what we see at high intensities, that the maximum heart rate might be 190 and now is 165, right? There's not enough catecholamines, which is a sign that the muscles are already reducing the glycogen breakdown into glucose, probably because they don't have enough glycogen. So this is a sign of fatigue. And sorry I went so long about it, but I find that this could be useful to understand the concept of heart rate to use in this context. But this, in many situations, is driven by, let's say that someone does a lot of high exercise intensity. So you burn a lot of glucose, and that glucose comes from glycogen. There's not enough repletion of that glucose because there's not enough nutrition in terms of carbohydrates. So overall, your glycogen tank, gets lower and lower and lower and lower and lower, right? And this is when you start having issues. Another thing that happens is that there's muscle damage. So muscle damage by too high intensity, not enough recovery, or poor nutrition. And these, for example, can happen when you have low glycogen content in your muscles. The body needs to keep going. And the brain kind of deals, makes an arrangement with the muscles. It's okay, look, I don't use so much glycogen because we don't have much, but I allow you to use more protein for energy purposes. And the protein, especially the glutamine and the branch-chain amino acids, can be utilized for energy purpose, either directly into mitochondria or through the liver into glyconeogenesis, which you can transform some of these amino acids back into glucose, right? So, but you pay a price because that protein comes from the muscles. So the muscles start eating themselves to feed themselves. So they enter into a catabolic situation, right? And when you get there, it's a vicious cycle because we know that when you have micro tears, like muscle damage, you can't store glycogen properly because it's probably, we don't know the whole mechanisms of repair, but it's probably all the glucose is utilized to rebuild that muscle. So you can't store much glycogen. So it's a vicious cycle, right? It's like trying to grab water with your hands. It's difficult, it escapes. So we can see this through different biomarkers in the blood. So this is why it's very important also to do blood analysis on a regular basis. So for example, with our athletes, I like to do with my athletes on a monthly basis, because every time we do a block, whether it's a training block or a competition block, I want to know how the body has assimilated that block. right? Is the body okay? Has assimilated correctly? And then we can move on to the next block. Or maybe the body hasn't assimilated that correctly. And that's what we do with this blood analysis. And there are multiple biomarkers that we can see.
That feels like a really big step, I think, for a lot of people. I don't know whether that's me or whether that's the kind of like British medical system, but the idea of getting bloods done feels like it would be something I would only do in extreme situations, you know, if I was really unwell or something like that. But I mean, there are ways of normal people getting blood analysis done, aren't there? Like, you don't have to go to a doctor to do it.
Yeah, and in fact, this area of biomarkers, it's exploding, right? Now there are multiple ways where you can, and even platforms that connect you with blood analysis laboratories, right? So, and more doctors, primary care doctors who embrace this, right? I'm not saying on a monthly base, right? But at least 2-3 times a year, or at least every time you feel that something's out of whack, right? When you say, hey, my performance is not well, I'm tired all the time, I don't know what's going on, blood analysis are important because you're going to see a lot of things. You might see that multiple things, for example, and most PCPs, right? Most primary care providers, they're going to be able to give you blood analysis, not every month, maybe, as you said, but maybe 2 or 3 times a year, or whenever you feel that something's out of whack, right? That more in an NHS system, for example, in England, right, or other systems around the world, right? But there are more and more private laboratories nowadays. They're different brands. I'm not going to name necessarily, where you can go and you can get blood analysis whenever you want to, right? You can do it online also and just show up and get your results, and then you can have someone interpret those for you. Or some of these platforms, they have algorithms also. So this area is exploding because of things like this, you know, that we see a lot of people with a lot of overtraining. So you could see different things of like a decrease in oxygen carrying capacity. That is a decrease in hemoglobin, for example. And that's a sign of overtrained too. Might be a sign also of not enough iron. So you can see then ferritin, which is the way we store iron in the body. And you might see the ferritin levels are very low, and therefore you're not going to be able to produce red blood cells. So that could be something there. And 1 gram of hemoglobin transports 1.34 milliliters of oxygen. So if you decrease 1 point your hemoglobin, you're going to decrease about 6-7% your oxygen carrying capacity. So that at the top end of exercise is going to decrease your performance, and you're going to tell for sure, right? Another thing is typical, as I mentioned earlier, muscle damage. So when there are micro tears, small tears in the muscles that normally when the muscle is solid, many enzymes in the muscles, they don't leak out to the bloodstream. But when there are micro tears, these enzymes leak out, and we can see them in the blood analysis. Other times we're talking about problems with anabolism or catabolism. So you might see, for example, cortisol is a catabolic hormone that is very high when there's physiological and or psychological stress, right? So it's very catabolic. It breaks down fatty acids, it breaks down glycogen, and it breaks down protein as well. So eventually, with very high levels of cortisol, you're going to end up in a catabolic state. So you can measure that, and then you can see that to counteract, especially in males, you're going to see high testosterone that needs to counteract that, right? So you might see that eventually testosterone gets depleted as well. So you can see this. Sometimes you can see that there's some infection, right? Many infections, they really, obviously, as we know, they influence your performance. So you might have some Epstein-Barr, or cytomegalovirus going on, which is not as rare as we think, right? So that's what, whenever someone thinks that there's something wrong, blood analysis are a good way to try to understand.
Yeah, and it strikes me then from this conversation that there are multiple ways to get into a state of overtraining. So you were saying, too much high intensity potentially means that you deplete your glycogen stores. And then also too much high intensity can cause muscle damage. But then also it feels like nutrition is a really, really key part of this as well. So under fueling sounds like it might be a real area to watch out for.
Absolutely. So exactly. So you took the conversation to the right point, where a lot of these overtraining situations start by with wrong nutrition, right? So when people are restricting carbohydrates, when they're restricting calorie intake, they're going to affect, many of these processes. And it's very important to if you want to lose weight, if you want to play a little bit with your nutrition, it's very important that you do that with a professional that's qualified for that, and that also understands metabolism, physiology, or is in close contact with the coach who understands this, right? Because everything has to be matched perfectly. And many people, they don't eat enough, so many, and they end up with a lot of problems, of overtraining, of fatigue, and they get to a point of this vicious cycle where they think it's normal, right? But it's not normal. And one thing that I wanted to bring up is hypothyroidism, right? So it's a condition that I used to see 1 or 2 people a year. Oh, now I've been seeing once a week, right? A lot of, I'm sure, there's no doubt that a good number or a lot of our viewers either have been diagnosed with hypothyroidism or know someone who has been diagnosed with hypothyroidism. So because this is the typical situation, they've been tired for months, dragging their feet, and I'm so tired for months. It's got to be work, it's got to be training, I don't know. But eventually they go to the doctors and they do a full panel of blood analysis, and there's a hormone, it's called TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that is stimulate the thyroid, and it's high, right? So that's where they are diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And the typical symptoms of hypothyroidism is constant fatigue for months and for months and for months, right? So if you go to your regular doctor and I've been tired forever, and it's like, that's not normal, you're tired forever. And okay, let's do blood analysis. That's a red flag, being tired for a long time. And then blood analysis show up high levels of TSH. Bingo, that's diagnosed as a hypothyroidism. So that athlete walks out with a prescription to take thyroid hormone, right? And for a condition that they never needed in the first place. So I've been working for years trying to work with endocrinologists, especially raising the awareness of this, because I see that it's quite prevalent among so many athletes. We closed down our facilities in Boulder, unfortunately, but we would see every week people in the Boulder area in Colorado. People are very active. People are, if you don't do a marathon or an Ironman in Boulder, you're nobody in a way, right? And so people would come, I've seen people crying, coming down, falling apart because they were incredibly tired and fatigued. And many people, they had been diagnosed with hypothyroidism. And then, so the thing is, you can avoid that by other blood analysis, and you can see that person, in fact, didn't have hypothyroidism, was cooked, was overtrained, was quite fatigued. And you can avoid that situation, because the problem that happens is people are giving thyroid medication, a microdose at first, very small dose, and it works really well. I might give them a 25, 50 micrograms, and whoa, I feel good. And it's if you're tired all the time, they give you a gallon of coffee, wow, you're going to be feeling good again, right? But eventually, it's a patch. You're not solving the problem. So people need 75 and 100 micrograms and 125 micrograms. And it gets to a point that the TSH, and the whole axis, pituitary axis, gets shut off. And then you're going to need thyroid medication, replacement hormone medication for the rest of your life. You cannot rescue that again. And this is unfortunate, because people that they didn't have hypothyroidism in the first place end up with a medication for the rest of their lives. So I just want to raise that awareness, because it's quite common. And again, I'm very sure many of the viewers either have been diagnosed or know someone who's been diagnosed. And hypothyroidism is extremely rare in athletic, fit population. There's family history, but it's typical. It's more common in people with obesity, like metabolic diseases, but it's quite rare in fit individuals.
It's not a side effect of overtraining I would ever have thought of, but really like quite shocking when you talk about it. So because we've touched, I guess, on ways you can tell if you're overtraining now. I suppose the ideal situation is that you avoid overtraining in the first place. And as you say, it happens to most people at some point or another. So it's important to know the signs. But what would your recommendations be for simply avoiding getting into that state in the first place?
So nutrition, as we touched, is an important thing, and training is the other thing, right? It depends on how you split your training. So if you're like more in that always do intervals and intervals and intervals and intervals, at some point you're going to fall into that overtraining, right? So, or if you don't prescribe the training zones correctly, you might think, let's say that you're training in your zone 2, but actually you're training in your zone 3, right? Then it's a higher metabolic task that day after day after day after day is going to cause fatigue, and if you throw then high intensity. So it's both ways. Is like make sure that your training is prescribed correctly and there's a balance, right? There's not so much high intensity that is going to really affecting you. People think, or some people still think, that elite athletes, they're always training high intensity. That's not true. If you look at training peaks, for example, of a world-class athlete, the majority, like about 90% of the entire year, is in the lower intensities, right? So that, because they cannot sustain that, you cannot do like always high intensity, and we still see in athletes, they do high intensity, professional athletes, right? They do high intensity, and boom, they start the season okay, and eventually they blow up. So prescribing exercise and the right balance is key, right? To avoid overtraining, and also nutrition is key. But as you see, both things go together, and this is why it's important to pay attention to those details. If you want to avoid overtraining, you need to balance both, and then be aware of signs of overtraining, like you feel fatigued, you feel tired all the time, your heart rate doesn't get up, right? Those are really signs that something is going on. And that would be the time to revisit your training, revisit your nutrition, and probably do a blood analysis, which can be very revealing of what's going on. And again, I insist, like if this happens, most PCPs, most providers, they're willing to give you a blood analysis, and they can either interpret that for you, or someone can interpret that for you. And again, there are more and more platforms online. You can do it yourself and things like that.
And when we talk about heart rate, resting heart rate used to be a real buzzword. Do you still recommend noting your resting heart rate as a way of checking for overtraining?
That's an excellent question. And people call me old school for that, but I still do that. And all my athletes, they do that, right? So it's a great way. As I said earlier, heart rate is a true physiological parameter, right? So, and I've been doing this since I was 15 years old, in fact. So you wake up in the morning, let's say your heart rate is 44 beats per minute, 48, and you use 44, 46, 48. And I remember when I was 15 years old, I would have like a piece of paper on my wall, and I would just write it down every day and do my graphs. We didn't have Excel sheets or anything like that, right? I did my own graphs, and I would see the trends, But it's very easy. You wake up in the morning, you don't need a heart rate monitor or anything. You can take your heart rate, or now if you have a very good, a smart watch, right? They can be giving you very accurate information. You can use it as well. And you can see, let's say you're 46, 44, 46, 48, and that's kind of steady. And one day, boom, is 55 or 58. That day, that something is not right? So it could be that maybe you haven't assimilated the day before, right? Or sometimes you might be incubating some virus, right? Because some virus are, the incubation period that people talk, especially now with the whole COVID time, the incubation period already, there's a physiological process happening in the body. So the body reacts. And again, heart rate is a true physiological parameter. It reacts when there's something going on, right? So I always tell people, pay attention to that. it might be that you might be tired and fatigued from the previous day. So that day, go out there and train with your radars, like a full on, and be aware of sensations if you don't feel good or so. And in fact, many people say, yeah, I don't feel it today. Like, yeah, that's why I was 10 beats per minute higher when I woke up in the morning, right?
And would you recommend to those people then that they just turn around in the road and go home? Just
100%. I think that, the way to, and this is another part of our culture, right? It's like, oh, I have to do these intervals today. I need to push through no matter what, because I'm a tough guy, right? Or a tough girl. You need to push through that. And that's not, to me, that's not the smartest situation, because you're already at a situation where you're overtrained, fatigued, and this is just going to make it worse. And it's going to dig the hole deeper. And the next day you do the same thing. And eventually what happens, many people blow up. And I've seen people, in overtrained situation for months, and it's not easy, and then gets to your head, right? And causes depression, eating disorders, because people say, oh man, like all of a sudden they might be very hungry. They'll start eating a lot and then gain weight, which makes things even worse, So you want to avoid to be in those holes. So those are signs, like the heart rate in the morning is a sign. The heart rate during the ride is a sign too. And then, then the sensations. You have to listen to your body. So the best day, turn around, go home, and tomorrow will be the same. The same thing, like when you feel that your heart rate is you are struggling a lot to keep up your heart rate, whether it's a zone 2 or zone 4, that means that you're tired that day. So the best thing you do, go home and eat more carbohydrates, relax, and you will feel that the next day you might feel like $1,000,000, because the heart rate will be responsive again, sensations are good again. Like thing in the morning, you might see that, okay, I'm going to take the easy, and tomorrow, you might go back to your normal baseline heart rate.
What about those days where, like, let's say you're training after work in an evening, and you finish work and you're like, oh, I feel tired, and then we've all done it. We've pushed through and we've gone out with our mates for a ride and we felt amazing. You suddenly discover that you've got great legs, and actually, is it a case that there's different types of tiredness that you need to interpret? So one which is kind of a fatigue that's potentially damaging, and one that's just, there's life that you can kind of push through. Is that fair, do you think?
Absolutely. And this is part of the training, right? It's one of the principles of training, right? You have a stimulus, right? And that stimulus is going to cause fatigue, right? Because whether you have done an interval or you have done a long day of training, it's going to cause fatigue at the end of the day, right? And it's normal. But then you have, as you recover, you have a recovery phase, and that recovery is by recovery itself and by proper nutrition, and that's necessary to achieve what's called super compensation. So you improve, right? And then the next day you do it again and you hit it, right? And you cause another fatigue. But by the next day, you should be okay, right? You should, again, that's the thing. You should, whether you go to bed tired today, for example, after a long day of training and work, etc., but you have done the right stimulus of training, and then tomorrow your heart rate, your baseline, when you wake up, should be normal. That's a sign that, although you were fatigued last night, you have recovered. And that fatigue is necessary, right, to elicit that recovery and the super compensation, right? If you feel like, I'm 10, 15 beats per minute higher, I haven't recovered well. Normally, it's going to be also accompanied by also the sensations. You perceive effort when you go out there on the bike, or even when you wake up already in the morning, like, oh my gosh, I'm dead today, So that's important. And sleep is a key, absolutely key. For people, if you don't get enough sleep, it's going to be really, really hard to really accomplish your goals, whether it's to do a century ride or a Gran Fondo or compete at the highest level.
Yeah, that's been super fascinating. I think a lot for people to think about there, but some really, really important messages as well. But what's great, I guess, is that they're fundamentals, aren't they? And it's easy. Everyone gets the fundamentals wrong from time to time, but it's that reminder to do things right and just be aware, I guess. That's of these signs, and something as simple as checking your resting heart rate, which is free for anyone to do. It's it's great that they're things that we could all put into place and practice.
Yeah, I agree, and those simple fundamentals have been always there, and you don't need fancy software, to do that. I'm not discourage people from using those new instruments and gadgets that we have today, like the rings and watches, etc. For sure, right? But those simple things, they can give you a lot of information that has been known for decades.
Great stuff. Well, Iñigo, thank you once again. It's been absolutely brilliant, and we hope to have you back on GCN very soon again.
Yeah, thank you very much, Simon. I really appreciate your invitation, and I enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much.